Yes, okay. I had, in the last segment, at the point where I had moved from the apprenticeship into the village of Harlem, where I had published my first book on an IBM selectric typewriter. And during that time, I met a young lady named Barbara Orange, and she was an astrologer. I was on a retreat with one of the legendary figures in Harlem, two of the legendary figures in Harlem, Dr. John Moore, who was an herbologist, and Kanya. And I went on a retreat with them, and on that retreat I met Barbara Orange. And from that, and Barbara Orange and I, we had a relationship, that a brief relationship, maybe about a year and a half. Other than that, I hadn't had too much to do with women because I was still expecting to go back with my wife. I couldn't believe I was separated from my mate, from my wife there, and my son. I could not believe, because that's something I said would never happen. If I had a son, I would never be separated from. But I found myself like that. So I wasn't that interested in the opposite sex as such, because one of the things I realized at that time, after studying struggle, after studying revolution, after studying the liberation struggle of black people as much as I could, especially those years in Harlem when I was down the street. The place where I lived in those years down the street was at the Schaumburg Center was on one corner of my block, and around the corner was the Schaumburg Library. So of course, you know, Khalifa lived in those institutions, because my mind, I was becoming awake in consciousness and looking for a way to make my impact on the liberation struggle of black people. During my apprenticeship, I had still decided not to formally join any organizations, because at that point, the Caucasian making his business to shut down the civil rights movement. And I concluded that one of the ways he was so successful at shutting down the civil rights movement is because black people did not own any independent media. We didn't own any independent radio, we didn't own any independent television or newspapers. We owned Negro institutions that said more or less what the going thing was that white people approved of. That is, except of course for the Nation of Islam and Muhammad Speaks. So I was of a mind that I was looking for something to contribute to the liberation struggle of black people, and here I found myself as a master printer, a master of the printed word, and I could produce a newspaper or a magazine like nothing. It was very easy for me. So I said that I would print an independent newspaper. But then once I got out there in the street, I found out I had to make a living. You know, I had to earn some money, and I had to earn this money without giving up 8 hours a day to white people. So I started working freelance and trying to help other people to publish their work, because I had not completed a book at this point. So I was fairly successful at not helping people to print books, but I was kind of successful at helping to distribute literature that was being produced by others, namely out-of-town newspapers like the Norfolk Journal and Guide and the African American newspaper. I became an agent for them in New York. And later on, as I was in that, the word got out that I was doing this, and a young man showed up with Africa Magazine, a magazine called Africa Magazine. And it was a bestseller. By any measurement, it was a bestseller. But so we founded United Brothers Communication Systems on the income that was coming in from Africa Magazine. So we opened up the first storefront called United Brothers Communication Systems, and we had a bookstore in the front, a printing press in the back, and an office in the middle. And we had weekly meetings. All of a sudden I had 15 brothers who was connected to United Brothers Communication Systems. We had some sisters too. And then the number one sister was found herself on the premises one day, and her name was Brother Khalifah. I mentioned her earlier, and I also mentioned earlier that I had stopped dating because I didn't want to waste my time, and I didn't want to waste the time out there partying when it was so beautiful, horning up my writing skills and my education, black consciousness, my involvement into becoming who I am was happening right there at that time. And it was a conscious decision I made to apprentice myself to certain mentors in Harlem, those community organizers. Robert Harris, Preston Wilcox, Simon Bly Jr., and Mr. Tolliver. I don't remember anything about Mr. Tolliver, but the man that I met that really helped me to get over to do the things I needed to do in order to be successful was a Christian bishop named Leon A. Bino. He owned a church in Harlem, a church building in Harlem, and in the basement of that church building was a full-fledged printing shop with all of the same kind of equipment I was working on downtown, and the only thing he used that shop for was to produce a church magazine, because he was not only the bishop of a church in Harlem, but he was a bishop of 7 churches in Jamaica and maybe 3 or 4 churches in England. So he would produce that newspaper down there. The other time it was dormant. And then he got sick and the whole shop, everything went dormant. So when I got there, it was doing nothing. But he wanted $15,000 for it, and of course, I didn't have $15 to pay for it, and he was just meeting me. So we couldn't handle that. But he did have a room for rent on the top floor in his building. So I took that room, even though I had already taken possession of a 7-room apartment up there near the place where the bookstore would ultimately become. And but I was a squatter in that 7-room apartment, and that's where I was first exposed to community service, because it was 7 blocks facing 7th Avenue at the time. Now it's Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. Was owned by the city. The landlords had abandoned it, and the city had taken it over, and the tenants in that development had taken it on themselves to organize into the 7th Avenue Tenants Council, and what they wanted was possession of the buildings. And of course the city was stalling on that. They would not give them possession of it, but they gave them what they call a conservatorship, or whatever terms they used to do that. But they put a young white group over them. So I came in at a time where they were struggling with him, to get rid of him, and I was there when we successfully got rid of him, because I published my first periodical there, and that was a community newsletter dealing with one subject on why we had to do for ourselves. Okay, so it was from that apartment that I rented the room with Bishop Bino, and later on, of course, opened this United Brothers Communication Systems headquarters, and we were flushing money, because on a monthly basis we not only had Africa magazine coming in by the thousands, imported from England, written entirely by black people and published by a Nigerian located in England. Authentic news from the continent. We were bringing authentic news through a magazine called Africa Magazine. So we were hits. So we made a name for ourselves there. That's where I made a closer connection to Dr. John Henry Clark, who was my neighbor in Harlem. But he was a writer that they liked to feature or consult with about that newspaper. And it turns out that he and I were friends because we were neighbors, and he believed in neighbor, and I believed in neighbor, and I believed in Dr. Clark. Okay, so but there came a time where I was collecting these manuscripts, great work, but I couldn't do any of the great work without a lot of pain. And one of the great works that I had the privilege of working on while I was there is a book by Dr. Amos Wilson, Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. As a matter of fact, that was the last publication and the 15th that we did there. But I knew, one thing I knew, I did not have any ambition to be a storekeeper in this little storefront there in Harlem. I needed to make some money. I needed to get more resources in order to do a greater work. So I prayed. I was going deeper into my spirituality. Prayer became more real for me. And then one day a young lady walked into the store and she was looking for some literature, and she was and also a drop-off point for one of the plays that she had produced, and her name was Brother Khalifah. Anyway, to make a long story short, she and I got together and I started dating again, and I fell in love for the first time in a long time. And she turned me on like no other woman has ever turned me on. Not because of what you may be thinking, but because of the fact that her intellect, she was gifted here, and she was gifted in understanding, and she agreed with me on all of the major points of the liberation struggle of black people, including the importance of the Nation of Islam in it. During the 1975, of course, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had transitioned in February. So the Nation of Islam was changing. I hadn't processed all the way into the Nation of Islam yet, even though I was processing. Sister Rita was already in, but she came in just before the transition of the nation into the regime of Waris-Din Muhammad. Maybe we'll get back to the Nation of Islam years one day, because I do have some good information about that. But to wind up this segment of my story, I will say that Sister Rita was already packed up and ready to go back to Virginia, but she stayed long enough for us to fall in love. So that holiday season, I went to Virginia, and we got engaged while I was down there, and I knew that I could make it in Newport News, Virginia. So in March of that year, within a year of our first meeting, we got married, and I moved to Virginia, but I couldn't make a living down there, so I was still selling literature, the literature that I produced in New York, and I was also acquiring literature from other publishers and other newspapers at the time, and I had an involvement in publishing the first full-fledged newspaper called Black Bulletin. That was, the editor-in-chief was Robert Mendices Harris, who was a Garveyite. And I had got a lot of Garvey experience from him, and including the fact when he found out that I was a master printer. Of course, he reminded me that Marcus Garvey was also a master printer, In fact, Marcus Garvey had served in an apprenticeship with someone else the same as I had. So we got married. I moved to Virginia, but I couldn't make a living there. I did take a job there for about 7 months at the Norfolk Journal and Guide as their production manager, and I used to write some op-ed pieces for the Norfolk Journal and Guide. You can look it up if you can find some of the back issues from 1981, from about June 1981 till about March of 1982. During that time, I was working at this Journal and Guide, but it was not a living wage. I was making about a third of what my job description called for, so I couldn't make it. I hung as long as I could because Dr. Reed, who was the publisher at the time, had told me those computer consoles he had there in automatic typesetting, I could use them to produce my books. But lo and behold, I was going about the business of doing that, but I ran into that Krabs-Inner syndrome part of some segments of black people. The other managers at that newspaper became jealous, and they told Dr. Reed if he didn't let me go, they were leaving, so he fired me. So all of a sudden I was without a job. My wife of 4 years, she had finally became pregnant during the time I was at the Norfolk Journal and Guide. She was about 8 months pregnant, and I didn't have a job, so I had to create a job for myself. I created a little newspaper in Newport News, Virginia, called the Newport News, and hired myself out to a St. John's Church, the Church of God in Christ. They had a printing shop, but they had a white boy who was the manager, and I took that, and I would get a commission based on the printing that I brought into him. In order to facilitate my job as a salesperson, I created my first newspaper called the Newport News. I wrote editorial pieces in there, news, and I also sold advertisements there. And St. John's printing shop, they printed the newspaper. Soon that was exhausted because the black community had been gentrified. So it wasn't autonomous as it used to be. It wasn't thriving anymore. So I had to find myself something to do because my wife was 8 months pregnant. I stayed until after she had our first child, and that first child was Brother Khalifah. After she was born, 2 weeks after she was born, I was on a train going to New York to get some money to pay our mortgage. We had managed to move into a house. She was in a little dream house there because we had a garden in the back. She was living in it, and we were going for it. And we didn't know she was going to get pregnant, but she did. And we were overjoyed that she was pregnant, but I knew then I had a responsibility to more than the liberation struggle of black people. As a matter of fact, I went into the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and he convinced us that the brother that keeps his family together is worth just as much as any revolutionary. So I got into that with my newspaper on the toe. I knew I wouldn't give that newspaper back, so I justified leaving home because I could stay in the struggle by publishing the newspaper and earning money in New York, working for my brothers, driving a taxi cab in New York, and doing whatever necessary except using these hands to manufacture printed words that I knew was poison to our people. That's where I drew the line. I would never use my trade to produce the kind of literature I did as an apprentice working for white people. So I would not use my skills to do that. So I had to create a job for myself. So I published my newspaper, printed the newspaper in New York, evolved the newspaper from a little newsletter, I still have some of them, into a full tabloid newspaper. and changed the name to the National Newport News and Commentator, and that's where a lot of people first heard about my service, and that's where I finally started making some inroads into the liberation struggle in ways that I could feel, because I used to get correspondence. I used to get letters for people who were praising me or commenting me on the character and the content of the newspaper, because we decided that our black people needed to be taught. They were at the point where they could be talked directly to, rather than beating around the bush or trying to say something in nice ways because we wanted advertisement from white people. I didn't care if I never got an ad in that newspaper. What I decided to do was advertise my own products. That had a moderate amount of success, but I still had to continue working in New York, working those menial jobs, but knowing what I was working for made it all worthwhile, because that wonderful lady in Newport News, Virginia, Sister Rita Farrar Khalifa, had my back. She had my back when I was there. She ran my business. When I came home, I would go to New York, make a lot of money in 2 or 3 weeks, and go home and stay 2 or 3 weeks and use up all the money that I had made in New York, because I was determined I would never get another job. Never. Especially for white people. So I made it in New York. Now, Sister Rita Farrar Khalifa is a remarkable person. Not only did she have our oldest daughter there, Tamarita Khalifa. Then she had Alike Aziza Khalifa. Then 4 years later, she had our baby girl, Nadira Uhuru Khalifa. And she breastfed each one to term. Some went past term. They enjoyed the breastfeeding in a wholesome way. And she was a health advocate, and she was a gifted writer, as her book will show. But okay, so we were there looking forward to the time where we could get enough success going that I wouldn't have to keep making these trips away from the family. We had a target date that I would continue making those trips away from family to support the family until the girls got up to school age. When the girls reached school age, if I had not generated enough to make it at home, I was going to come back to Newport News and swallow hard and take whatever I could to make it from there. But I was going to support that family, that wife and 4 children. Now in 1988, it turns out that the New York Times had picked up on the drift that there was some movement among black people as far as our literature is concerned. So they started looking around to find out who was producing this literature, and I got a call one day when I was in New York from a New York Times apprentice reporter, what do you call her, intern. She was there from New York, and she started developing a story about me. And she told me, I asked her, how did she find me? She said when she started looking to find out who was doing anything in black publishing, this was in 1988, she said everyone kept pointing to me. So she took it on herself to call me, and so we developed the story, and she, it didn't publish during the time when she was in New York during an internship during the summer. But the managing editor, or the editor of the business section, he liked what she had did, and he took over it himself, and he started calling me. Now, lo and behold, I had found ways to live in Harlem without spending the money I was earning to take home, so I don't have to work when I get home. So I lived every place from basements to my car, and after that got too hard, I moved to the Bronx into a number hole that was run by my brother. Sorry, Bob, but you transitioned now. So you'll forgive me if I tell them that you were a gambler. You wrote numbers. But this was my best buddy. He was definitely a United brother, because my brother Bob, one day I'll tell how he used to help me to stay out there, because I didn't want to give up what I was doing to go get a job. So he would give me some money sometime when he had it. So what we did, I had moved. I heard that he had an apartment there, that he took the numbers in one part of the apartment, but he had a vacant room in the back where they played cards on Thursday nights. And he told me I could rent that room as long as I didn't come in early on Thursday night. So I rented that room, and it just so happens that the New York Times reporter, I gave that telephone number as a contact number for me. And fortunately for me, when they called to check up on me to let me know that the story was going to be published in August of 1988, Bob answered the phone, and the New York Times announced that New York Times calling to talk to Khalifah. So when I got home, Bob told me about the story with the New York Times. I told them that they had been developing this story, but luckily for me, he answered the phone. So that morning in the kitchen, that Saturday morning, he asked me, he said, well, Herman, he still called me Herman at the time. He was struggling to say Khalifah, but he said Herman. So I said, yeah. But he said, you know, what are you doing down there? He said, the next time you go to Virginia, I'm going to come down there and see what you're doing. Now, he had noticed there had been a change in my work schedule. I had started staying longer in New York, working longer hours. I was saving more money because I needed more money. I had crashed and bought a computer to go along with my other, so I could upgrade my publishing. And that was kicking my butt up. That was about $500 extra a month. So when Bob told me he was going to come down, I knew what he meant, because when you gamble, sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. And obviously Bob must have had it. He said, the next time you go there, I'm going to come down there and see. He said, what do you need? So I thought of $25,000. That's what I estimated I needed. But instead of saying, I didn't think it would go to $25,000. So part of my intuition kind of kicked in. Instead of saying $25,000, I said, Bob, if I had $10,000, I could become one of the leading black publishers in the whole world. And since he had seen me climb over so much, he had followed my career, he believed in me. He didn't disbelieve it. He said he was going to come down there and see what else I needed. So when I got back down there, he came down and he brought me $10,000. So when you hear me say I never borrowed any money from anybody, I never borrowed any money from any white people to do this business. I borrowed that $10,000 from Bob, and he did not stress me about paying him back. But that helped me to set up my mail order business and to stabilize my newspaper, and also to have enough resources so that when Sister Rita came out with a newspaper called the Tide Entertainment Guide, I told her after it flopped, because she had it on the wrong premise, she thought that she could get ads from white people. She was not convinced that I had made the best effort because I was so black. She said I was so black, so I wasn't getting the kind of newspaper and the kind of distribution channels. So she and her girlfriend, they were going to do one up on me. So they came up with the Tide Entertainment Guide. And of course, they got no ads, and they were crestfallen and kind of downhearted. So I said, look, if you made that paper something that was relevant to my business, the publishing business, we can, I'll publish it for you. So she said, well, okay, I'll call it your Black Books Guide. I said, fine. So the Black Books Guide is what made it, along with Bob's $10,000 when he came down there. Now, a lot of people, that the New York Times did run that story, and a lot of people saw what was happening to me at the time, and a lot of people want to give the credit to the New York Times, and I guess I will too, but in a backhanded kind of a way. I did get the calls from great big white people who control advertising on network advertising, prime time on television. One guy made an offer to me. He said, I'll advertise your books and you just share some of the proceeds from the sale. I said, fine. I had some meeting with him. He was a really big one. But when I sent him my books, I had to decide whether I was going to send him the safe books or would I send him the destruction of black civilization, message to the black man, and those books. In the end, I decided to come forthwith and send him my books. And of course, I didn't hear from him anymore after that. So, but anyway, and then I heard from people overseas and stuff. None of that materialized. But if it was not for the New York Times article, maybe Bob would not have seen the kind of success that I was having in the national black community. A lot of people didn't realize how I was doing that newspaper, or it was just a one-man operation. But he gave me the money to set it up, so that came indirectly because he filled the phone calls from the New York Times. Okay, so I set it up, and after that, of course, I met Lucina, and Lucina started buying my books. But the books he really wanted was Nation of Islam books. So I bought Nation of Islam books on the open market and resold them to Lucina. But my source in the open market soon was exhausted, and they had no more books to sell. So Luther asked me, he said, well, can you print them? I said, sure. But of course, I didn't know if I could or not. So I checked it out. Fortunately for me, I've had direct access to Minister Farrakhan for many, many years. Not always directly, but indirectly. My mentor in the Nation of Islam, which is why I'm an independent Muslim today, was Mahmoud Ramza. This is another one of these names that I must mention. Mahmoud Ramza, the nation's jeweler. Now, he had the phone number to Minister Farrakhan's bedside. So he said, I'll check it out for you. So he called the Minister Farrakhan, and the word came back. Minister Farrakhan said he has no control over who reproduces the Nation of Islam, especially Mahmoud Ramza, who was his friend. They came into the nation together. They got the X on the same night, so they were tight. Okay, so I started producing. I told Lucina that I could do it. He wanted How to Eat to Live Book 1. He wanted 2,000 copies. So I sold him those 2,000 copies at whatever he wanted to pay me. And he wanted 82% discount from the book. So I had to discount my books to him at 82%. The only thing I told him, I did the math and I could not make it. I knew the key to it was to get it paid for, because I didn't have any money to invest in it. So what I told him, I said, Luther, if you increase that order to 3,000, we could make a deal. So he increased it to 3,000, and with his money, paying for 3,000 at about $2.25 a book, I was able to print 5,000 books. So I had 2,000 that I could sell at the going rate out there, take care of the 3,000 for him. And so that's how I really got into this black, really started making money in the industry because of Lucina, which even today is the most gifted black bookseller the world has ever known. Lucina is great. He's good. Of course, I found out later on that he and his fellow people from Trinidad, Luther, you may be looking at this, but I don't care. You and your brethren was over here, you were making the money, but you were not reading the books. But you get credit and you'll get your name in history because of the fact you saw value in our literature and you helped to get us over. So from there I published Message to the Black Man, Stolen Legacy, Miseducation of the Negro, and the money was pouring in. And then Shahrazad Ali called me up one day. She wanted to use my newspaper to publicize her book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman, 6 months before the book came out. Shahrazad was doing her groundwork. She called me up. I agreed that I would give her ad space for books, and if she paid some money. She agreed to my offer, and the book came out and it was a blockbuster. So that made a big difference. Of course, she reneged on her agreement to trade books for advertising space for a minute until I reminded her. Then she honored her word and told me that she just went out of that first printing so fast. So we did that, and she and I got tight. My wife read the book, and she was not anti-Shahrazad like most black women were at the time, or so it seems. My wife read the book, and we discussed it, and we saw the value in the book. We saw the value of the issues that she was discussing more so than the remedies that she was offering to cure it. We became friends, they became friends, and then after we started making money, it was time to restart some of the programs of United Brothers Communication Systems in the 70s before I got married and went to develop the business. So now we were, so we had the second annual presentation of Black Book Awards for Excellence in Black Literature in 1991. And the first one was 1978. So I kept my idea all that time. You know what I mean? The last one in 1978 was where we debuted Amos N. Wilson's Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, and that tape is someplace. Somebody stole that tape from me, Brother Dalani. He taped it, but I haven't seen him again since. Brother astounded with that tape. As an aside, Queen Mother Moore, she agreed to speak. She agreed to speak at this one on one condition. She said she had a message for the sisters, and she had a condition on me. She said, I don't want no videotapes, I don't want no radio, I want nothing. I just want to talk to the sisters. She spoke. I kind of wish I had taped it, but I had to honor my word to Queen Mother Moore. As legendary she was, as beautiful, as lovable she was. So that was not done. She was on the same program as Amos Wilson. But anyway, we made this money. The Black Book Movement came into vogue. And then I opened up this bookstore at Hampton University in Harlem, opened up a fantastic 15-foot of space in downtown Harlem at the a shopping center opened by Hampton University. And we were one of the few black businesses in the area that probably could afford the rent, which is started at $1,200 a month. And by the end of the lease, they were going up to $1,800 a month, and I had to get my own insurance. I also knew I had to get my own building because I had outgrown it. And it was at the time where I knew I had to get to a point where I could produce the literature, and I had just ordered 25,000 copies of Message to the Black Man, and I needed a big place to store them. So we found this carpenter's building there in downtown Hampton, about 10,000 square foot of space, but the building needed to be renovated. It was renovated before we moved in, not before we moved the Message to the Black Man in. So they got a lot of sawdust, but the books was preserved. Nobody, at this point, I still didn't qualify for anybody loaning me any money through any banks. So we renovated that building. We bought the building and did the renovation from our cash flow and from our savings. So that's the level of money we were making. At this point, we were depositing in up to $15,000 a week. A week. That's the kind of money we were making there. Not for long. For about 4 years. That's the kind of money we were doing. We were dealing with in this book industry. Lucina was grossing well over $5 million. A&B was a spinoff from Lucina. He was making it. Black people were gravitating to their own literature. And this was one of my long-standing statements and motivation for staying in this business through those lean years in the 70s and 80s. I had studied our history. During tough times, black people tend to turn back to their own. And I think after the 1960s and the civil rights movement, and when they realized that they had been sold a bill of goods, and the Caucasian had gutted the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was not doing what black people expected it would, and it took them to the 1980s and they started turning back to themselves. And I wanted to be there when they did turn back to themselves so I could serve them. And I also wanted to be in a position to acquire some resources so when a young black man or woman came out in the community with an idea, I would have resources that I could help them in ways that the resources was just not there to help me, not with the kind of ideas that would liberate us. But anyway, the level of income made it possible for me to get the building, hire a lot of people, start a private school in the building. We had a one-room schoolhouse within the building. We were determined that our girls would never see a public school. They would be homeschooled, or we were going to finance Harambe Home School. That was the name of our school, Harambe Home School. No, I like your business course, what you're doing. But Harambe Home School, we said that if the business failed, the home school would fail. In other words, we made it part of our business and made it a for-profit. And we carried that along with our taxes. We paid the administrators, we paid the teachers, because the people who could least afford it was the one who believed in it mostly. So most of the other students could not afford to pay the tuition. And we wanted our children to have some classmates. And we could afford it, but it taxed the business. It really did tax the business, but not that strong. The business wasn't taxed until Caucasians decided to start selling our literature. And when they decided to start selling our literature, our gross sales went down. Giuliani in New York swept all the street vendors off the street, whereas our daily cash flow was coming from. And so there was a lot of things coming to bear. But unlike a lot of my friends in the industry, I had invested my money in 123-acre land down here in Southampton County. I had invested in a farm with the idea of fulfilling a promise I had made to Sister Rita when she was so steadfast with me during the 1980s. I told her that I saw how she was able to work with little money, what she's able to do with little. I said, one day you're going to have big money, and I'm going to build you a dream house. And so the place where we sit tonight is part of that promise. We bought the land first, but since I still did not qualify to get mortgage loan, even though I had the VA right, veteran rights and things like that, because I didn't have W-2 forms. So we bought the land and built a small building on the land. And meanwhile, I'm still publishing and selling books, like and buying old cars. I refused to buy a new car. I bought old cars because of the insurance rates, and I invested my money into the literature of people who had ideas. Most of my profit from those publishing offices right downstairs right now. Some of the books didn't have markets, but I invested in them anyway. And I have not one moment of regret for doing that. I'm glad I was able to do it because the books are still selling, some of them. You know, so it was not a bad decision, despite what some people may think. But anyway, I'm getting a little giddy now, so I get, okay, I'm trying to get back serious so I can wrap it up here now. Because now after it will, the rest of it will take on kind of a serious tone. After we moved into the building and founded the Harambe Home School and had the printing shop, I had one black printer that was doing my small books, and he was going out of business, so I bought his shop out. And he came with it for a minute. If he and his wife had stayed in it, we could have made it. But he bailed out after 2 months. I guess he didn't want to work for anybody. He bailed out, and so I could never find another skilled worker to manage that stuff. We did have one, but he didn't have real good habits. You know, he would disappear sometime. Sorry, Lawrence. His name was Lawrence Colvin. One of the great young men that I met. He made a difference, mainly because he could operate any printing equipment in the shop. But anyway, we did this, and this is where we were in 1993. When we moved into the building, we had the land, we had a place to live on the land, we had the printing shop. I had the book, the second book that I wrote, but refused to publish it until I was representative of what was in the book, and that is a how-to book, how to be successful, how to do this, how to acquire this, how to do that. And I met so many people who write these great books, but then when you meet them, they're not really representative of what's in the book. And I didn't want to deal with that contradiction, not on a metaphysical book. It's called Conscious Attunement and the God in I. So I didn't put that book out. But in 1993, we're in the building. I'm still going on my book, Conscious Attunement and Good and God and I, and developing it, editing it, reading it, and benefiting from it. Benefiting from the meditations that are offered in it. But in 1993, I was also free enough and had enough staff at United Brothers Building to start taking the family on annual summer trips. We always had our family trips, but we started going to Cobra Convention on our family trips. And that's where I took the family up there. We joined in Cobra, joined on with Dr. Obadeli. I was going to join the Republic of New Africa, but on the advice of someone who was in the Republic of New Africa, he warned me how honeycombed it was with agents. And they said, you don't know who the agent is. So why don't you? So I decided to join in Cobra. And Dr. Obadeli was there in Cobra. I was there because Dr. Obadeli was there. Sorry, other members of Cobra. But I always loved Dr. Obadeli since reading his Foundations of a Black Nation and some of the other literature. So I was there and I worked with them. My family made those trips to Cobra, to those conventions. And then in 1995, Minister Farrakhan started the organizing for the Million Man March. And of course, you know, me as the only Muslim only black Muslim in Cobra, they had voted me onto the National Board of Directors sometime prior. It was 2-year terms, and I recommended that we endorsed the Million Man March, and I dare say that we were the first national black organization to endorse the Million Man March. So, and then the Million Man March speaks for itself. I was a part of it. I could have been on the stage, but I was back there with my people. And when I decided to try to make it to the front so I could get into the press section, I had my press pass. Didn't even get up there to get my press pass in time so I could get on the stage, so I could get a picture of that crowd out there. It was too packed. Couldn't get past too much, so I just relaxed and enjoyed it out there. A week later, a brother brought me my press pass, to prove that they did right by me. So, but then, sometime after that, I realized that I can publish my book, Conscious Attunement and the God and I. Two things happened then. I assessed my situation. I had this land, I had these employees, I had this beautiful mate, I had these gorgeous children, including these Harambe homeschool children, about 13 of them. And my three made 16. And then I became fast friends with Dr. Carol Barnes, who wrote the book called Melanin Conscious, no, he wrote the book called Melanin, the Chemical Key to Black Greatness. So he and I became friends, and he was at a lot of my programs. And then I met Dr. Richard King. He started writing for the newspaper. So I edited his series of articles into a book and published him. And then I was reading the book, and I realized that one of the meditations in the Conscious Attunement is where I'm peering through, where I'm imagining peering through a black dot. And I realized that's melanin. Dr. King wrote a book, and in that is a chapter called The Black Dot. And that black dot is where the inception of melanin is located in the human body. Okay? Now, so I put that book out, and then in 1996, early 1996, we had started constructing the house from our own funds, and then tragedy struck the family. In early 1996, a lump was detected in Sister Rita's left breast. She decided to treat it holistically, so we went through 1996 into the fall. And she started stressing back then. So we found a spiritual institution that gave us a lot of comfort. The Nation of Islam, the Temple of Islam in Richmond, Virginia. I went to visit that temple reluctantly because anytime somebody said they were organizing under the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I just went out of habit. But I stopped going so much because I had decided, I was usually disappointed when I saw what was going on. They were trying to do it exactly like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Meanwhile, he had came here among us, he had did his work, and he had moved on. He had departed. So I knew, just trying to follow verbatim what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad did and some of the other leaders in the past did, you're going to get what you can't do the work of a great man. You can base your work on what he's doing and don't disrespect it. But these brothers were true to the teaching. I went to check them out, and lo and behold, they had a mosque full of people, and they were true blue. They were true blue as far as the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But they were innovative. They were doers for self. They were doing for self, and they were empowering the family. So I wanted to be a part of that, and I managed to. Sister Rita and I had been looking for a mosque together, and then decided that we would have to build a mosque up here on this land. But when I met them, I went to check them out first, then I brought her back. She had 4 visits up there before she got so sick she couldn't do it anymore. So to go over, not to ever try to recount any of the stress that her illness brought to the family, but we stress on the positive, and this is what we remember. We remember the good memories of Sister Rita, but also just the summer part, just to let the world know how serious we are about making our maximum contribution to the liberation of black people, those at home as well as those abroad. So Sister Rita went to Honduras for a last-ditch effort at a cure, and she transitioned in December 1997. And the house was not completed at that point, her dream house, but in 1998, in February 1998, I kept the three girls together, the three of us, the four of us, moved into the house up here in Virginia, and we kept selling the books, we kept the business open in Hampton, and I was looking for someone to put in charge of the business there so I could do my work up here as planned, workspace and work to spread out. But unfortunately, of the 17 employees we had, I couldn't identify anybody who stepped up to the plate, And so we kept it open down there for 2 years after her passing. And so right now, I kept my place on the board of directors up in Cobra and until 2002. And by that time, the work of the Caucasian people in selling our literature and raiding us, underselling us, and the black distributors, Lucina and A&B and them, didn't have the same appreciation for our liberation struggle as we born in black America have. Of course, they didn't know the importance of the literature, so they sold to whoever came with the money. Yes. Sadly, Sister Rita never had the opportunity to live in a dream house, but her family has lived here with her spirit prevailing. Now, as we wrap this segment up, I can't go without mentioning two major things that'll always be with us. One is the Nat Turner Trail, and the other one is my marriage to Sister Judy Carter and the experience with Conquering Books in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, the land, the 123 acres, this happens to be on the same land where Nat Turner's birth was, where he planned and enslaved that revolt. He planned that revolt. Now, we knew this when we bought the land, and so we also knew about his efforts, and so we coined the phrase the Nat Turner Trail, and now I am really the senior tour guide for the Nat Turner Trail, or one of the seniors, the one who taught me, the two people who were instrumental in finishing up my education about Nat Turner. They are still alive. One is Alexis Joyner, Professor Alexis Joyner at Elizabeth City State University, and the other one was James McGee and his wife Lavinia McGee in Cabrum, Virginia. And of course, you know, their grandchildren's Noah and Elon. And now, as we wrap up here now, let me just say that it's been a great adventure, this life from Alabama, coming over to 2009, with having published some 600 books, thousands, probably millions of newspapers, because I published a newspaper, and written well over 1,000 articles, and I published about 12 books of my own. And as I was closing the business in Hampton, I met a young lady from Charlotte, North Carolina. I didn't meet her then. I published her book. She was the last book published out of Hampton, Virginia, Judy Carter. And she wanted to know why was I closing up a business that was still busy. And she had the aspiration of opening a business in Charlotte. That's how Conquering Books came into being. I helped her to open up a publishing office down there in Charlotte. Later on, we got married, and that's history in the making. So is those Nat Turner Trail tools, and this land where we are now we recently began calling it the Khalifah Estates because now we're growing food. The children are grown, and we have 4 college graduates, including the 3 girls that I was a single parent up here for 7 years, and it's been a great life. And I look forward to meeting the challenges necessary to fulfill my ambition to maximize my contribution to the total uplift of black people. Thank you very much.
Not gonna leave my battery pack this time. I'm gonna pack it up right now.
Yeah.